Welcome to the Shadow of Truth with your host Dave Cransworth from InvestmentResearchDynamics.com and Rory Hall from DailyCoin.org. Today is Monday, March the 23rd, 2015, and we have a very special guest on today. And Dave, I understand you've got a couple of news items you wanted to discuss before we bring our guest on.
Yes, real quickly here, I just wanted to mention a couple of important economic reports that were out today. I want to preserve as much time as possible for Jim Willie because I know he's going to have a lot to say. But the Chicago Fed National Activity Index was out today. It's a monthly index. It's a very, very comprehensive so-called diffusion index. It's a weighted index, and it was negative. And not only was it negative, but January's was revised from slightly positive to negative. The primary driver of the negativity was consumption and housing. And in my opinion, what I think this report is showing us is that it basically shows why the Fed's not raising interest rates, because the economy is starting to head into a recession. And related to this, it seems like the worse the economic news gets, the harder the Fed and the Treasury try to pump up the stock market. Because if the stock market sells off, they're going to have a real catastrophe on their hands. The second metric that was out today was February's existing home sales. And because it's a seasonally adjusted annualized rate that gets reported, it's very difficult to tell exactly what's going on beneath the surface in terms of actual sales, but it did show a slight bounce from January's number. Recall January's home sales plunged 5%. So overall, I think the report shows continued weakness in the housing sector, as I've been writing about, and also, most importantly and most bearishly, in my opinion, the fact that the investment buyer, especially the big institutional investment buyer, is fading from the scene here, and that's going to pull the legs out from underneath the housing market. Clearly, pardon me?
No, go ahead.
Clearly, we're at near record low mortgage rates, and both Fannie, Freddie, and the FHA have all relaxed their credit standards. They've done what they can to reduce the amount of upfront cash required for first-time buyers to buy homes. It's not helping the numbers. It's only going to get worse from here.
That Chicago report that came out, doesn't that kind of support the Baltic Dry Index that you and I spent an enormous amount of time on discussing and showing how it clearly shows that our economy is deteriorating, and now we have another metric that shows, that confirms that. And those two combined, wouldn't that actually prove that we are, or show beyond there's not much question that we're heading into a recession or are full blown into one. Or is that right?
Nope, you're absolutely right, Rory. That report reinforces the message being given to us by the Baltic Dry Index and also from the price of oil, which had a dead cat bounce over 50, and now it's back it went into the low 40s on Friday, and they've juiced it, or on Thursday, and they've juiced it back up to the mid 40s. I think oil is going to be headed lower from here.
There you go.
It also reinforces the view here in terms of the sub-index that showed consumption and housing declining. I mean, it kind of tells me that the underlying data is suggesting that the National Association of Realtors seasonally adjusted annualized rate number is not correct. It's overstating what's going on in the housing market. And one more thing about the Chicago Fed National Activity Index is that it's missed Wall Street expectations now for 3 months in a row. In fact, the expectation for February was that it would show a gain, and it actually came in negative. So expectations about what's going on in the economy are still way too high.
They always are. Because the Wall Street gang is only looking out for their quarterly and annual bonuses. So, of course,
they'll put whatever spin they can on their forecast to try and generate the next stock sale.
Exactly. Has nothing to do with you and I. It's all about them. And we have a very special guest on today, Mr. Jim Willie, editor of the Hat Trick Letter that can be found at goldenjackass.com. How you doing today, Jim?
Oh, doing great. It's always good to record. It's always good to share what I've learned and what I expect to happen. And I know a lot of people are suffering with some tough weather, or they're recovering from some tough weather. And life and times are difficult, you guys, and it's not going to get any easier this year.
I would think not. Not with all the economic news that we've got going on, flying around. I mean, the real economic news, not the stuff coming out of the mainstream media.
Oh, I agree. It's I said last October and November that when the new year began, especially in February or so, we're going to have an acceleration of events. And I think we're starting to see that. I think January was just loaded with big events. And the Chinese New Year was told to me by some very special sources. Chinese New Year of February 19 was going to be a turning point where the door gets open to a number of different channels working simultaneously for bringing about what I call the global paradigm shift. And that's basically the retirement of the dollar and the reinstallation of the gold standard, both in trade and banking. First in trade, then in banking. So we have a lot of events. And last week, we were talking before the recording began, last week was a real juicy week, was it not?
It was pretty incredible, with all of the European allies jumping ship from the Wall Street criminals and signing on with China and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank.
Yes, it was. That's, some people say, well, big deal. I get some detracting comments. I leave myself open. Of course, I have direct contact with my client base, and that's not a few people. But I've also got a window from my Golden Jackass website. It's Contact Us. So that's where the hate mail comes, and that's where the nice comments come, and that's where interesting little articles come from, gosh knows where. A woman in Cambodia started contacting me with a lot of information. A very sweet lady, a bright lady with an American background, but also some Japanese background, genetically, her family. So I hear the stupidity that, well, this Asian bank that for infrastructure, big deal. Well, very big deal. That's what the World Bank has been for the last 50 years. Very big deal. So last week we had, some momentum going into the week with Australia in, I'm not exactly sure. I think it was sometime around the end of February. Australia signing on with the Chinese-led Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And then Britain signed on, and Obama and the State Department made some nasty comments to the British to the effect that, here you go again, London, catering to the Chinese. And this is a follow-up of something that happened last year, extremely important. London setting itself up as an RMB trading hub. RMB standing for renminbi, it's kind of a nickname. It means people's money in Chinese. RMB is the Chinese yuan. I got some very naive clients who say, well, isn't that interesting? China has two currencies. No, they have the yuan, and it's called the RMB. That's like saying, some foreigner saying to an American, oh, it's interesting, you got $1 and $1. Yeah. What's that all about? It's the same thing. All right, so you've got the Chinese working to replace the World Bank and a lot of other different platforms. But here's a list of the nations that followed. And this is not a assigning. These are not signatories to the AIIB. These are nations whose finance ministers and their big banks and central banks and whatever are in negotiation with the Chinese and the People's Bank of China and some of their big banks for terms of operating and managing and accounting for the AIIB. In other words, they don't want to pitch in $5 billion and then only find out later that one of the $5 billion was taken by some guy who runs a big corporation in Shanghai. They want safeguards. All right, so here's a list of the countries that followed Britain and Australia, which got some heat from the U.S. The nations are Italy, France, Germany, Luxembourg, Switzerland, and now Japan. I was told Japan would be the last. And it's really important to watch the Asians, the East Asian nations, the powerhouses who are in close league with the United States, namely South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan. Japan holds $1 trillion or more of U.S. Treasury bonds. Okay, I don't want to get into the whole story of Japan, and there's a lot of serious stuff going on in Japan right now because the U.S. back in October demanded their $1.2 trillion pension fund. This is how we're financing the Treasury bond, people. The debt, the U.S. government debt. So only South Korea remains. And now, over the weekend, Obama had a photo op with him looking sheepishly in attendance at a big table with all the major AIIB Eastern nation representatives. And the title in the article that I read was Obama throws in the towel. This is damage control. I've been saying for 3 years now, I started the forecast in 2012, that the U.S. is going to make a lot of different errors. They're going to, continue this QE forever. Remember back in 2012, we were told QE was going to be temporary to finance the debt and stimulate finance and investment in the economy. It doesn't stimulate the economy at all. There's a huge wall to prevent any kind of monetary movement from the banks to the economy. A huge wall. All right, so back in 2012, it was not obvious that QE was going to be to infinity. It was not obvious that the bond monetization was going to go on forever. But that's what I forecasted, and it's turning out to be correct. It's very hard to say I've got a correct forecast for something happening forever, but here we are in the fourth year, 4 years done, 12, 13, 4, no, three full years done. And in the fourth year, it's looking like QE is permanent. So we've got these big trends going on where the West clearly dominates banking and the East clearly dominates commerce and trade and to a great extent manufacturing. Look at all the emerging market nations that are very strong in their export trade, and they're accumulating significant Forex reserves. So I've made the comment that since the United States has been blocking the return of the gold standard through the Forex windows, we're going to see the gold standard return through the trade ramps. So the gold standard is going to happen first in trade settlement, and notice all the different bilateral swaps in the yuan, and now we're getting actual bilateral trade being settled in RMB, and sometimes it's not with China. It's just two countries settling in RMB. So we're seeing the dollar being pushed aside. Sooner or later, we're going to see a massive flow of major banking systems dumping their treasury bonds because they don't want them anymore. They're not going to use them anymore. And that's when QE4 comes in, where the Fed says we must soak this up. Notice the set. It's like a complete package of foundation platforms that have been under construction. I like to start with the most important one, not this Asian infrastructure bank. That's not the most important. That's the most visible in cracking the alliance across the world centered in the West. The most important, in my opinion, is the new development bank. And that's the one where that it has $200 billion, and it originally was to be for development. Well, if the AIIB is for infrastructure, I ask the very important question, then what is the new development bank for if it's not for development? And I love the pregnant pause after that. If AIIB is for infrastructure projects and development, then what is the new development bank for? I say it's to convert treasury bonds, euro bonds, UK gilts, and Japanese government bonds into gold and to become the BRICS Gold Central Bank. Okay, then there's another fund. It's called the Crisis Management Account, the Crisis Reserve Account. I remember the acronym CRA. That's for avoiding financial market crises with hot money moving out. Remember in 98 or what was it, 97, the Asian meltdown started in Thailand. Well, Thailand didn't have access to any crisis reserve account. Now they do. Okay, then you have the AIIB as mentioned. There's another big platform. It's called the Shanghai Gold Exchange. It really didn't have any presence at all a little over a year ago. But now they've got two big events in line to make it a very important platform, and that is they wrestled the gold fix away from London, and soon, I think it's going to be in a few months, they're going to have an RMB-based gold futures contract. All right, so I got some criticism from I think a half-witted client who I dismissed. I just canceled his order for the insults, but he told me, it looks, Jim, like you're trying to say that China, in your comment that a weapon not used can be more valuable, that you're no different from all the other shills. No, I'm saying that the Chinese are going to use their advantage with the Shanghai Gold Exchange and follow through with the gold fix, follow through with the RMB futures contract for gold, and then take action with the gold price after they take care of all the foundation mechanisms with all the cables and all the levers and everything necessary to prevent an overnight reversal of their lift in the gold price, which is kind of what we saw in a trial run. I think it was Wednesday or Thursday last week. We saw a big move up, and I think it was close to like $80 or $100 in gold, and it was gone by the next day. All right, the Chinese don't want that, so it's not like they're not going to use their weapon in hand. They're going to use it as they see fit to bring about the proper change to make it stick. Okay, they've got some other supporting agencies. We've mentioned the Development Bank, the Crisis Fund, the Infrastructure Investment, the Gold Exchange. They've got debt rating agencies. Dagong is one. The Russians have another. They have their credit cards. Union Pay out of China is one. The Russians have another. They have their Swift Banking Transaction Alternative, the CIPS. I think it's going to be called CHIPS before long, out of China, and the Russians have their own. So the Russians and Chinese systems are going to merge. What I like to say is that the Russians and Chinese are tightening their belt and tightening the noose around the Western neck and the dollar. Oh boy. So as you see the Ukraine war and the sanctions against Russia, and then the reverse response Russian ban on European food, and you see the U.S. with their trade pacts, which are nothing more than gigantic corporate power grabs. I'm referring to the Trans-Pacific Partnership that no Asian country wants. I'm talking about the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Pact, TTIP, that no European country wants. We're trying to jam these down their throats to get a corporate political power center in place. And the Europeans and the Asians are saying, we're going to voice our objection by joining the Chinese AIIB. So the more we pressure with the trade pacts and with the war and the sanctions, the more the Asians and Europeans respond with the Chinese financial platforms. I think China, to sum it up, joined the International Monetary Fund to kill it. And I think Christine Lagarde is a discarded old hag. The World Bank is going to wither away like a tattered flag on an abandoned fort.
I agree with that. Completely agree with that. I just wanted to circle back really quickly, Jim, if you don't mind, to when you had talked about the Shanghai Gold Exchange, and also sort of correlate it with your comment about the Chinese New Year. And I don't know how closely you follow it, but my fund subscribes to a 3 times daily news report, or the news and analytical report. It covers the global gold market. And one thing I've noticed is that typically on a seasonal basis, after the Lunar New Year celebration, or Lunar Dragon, whatever they call it, typically gold imports into China tend to decline a bit from a seasonal standpoint. And actually, ever since the Lunar New Year this year, I've noticed that both deliveries into the Shanghai Gold Exchange and withdrawals from the Shanghai Gold Exchange have accelerated quite a bit. I mean, they're probably up 20% year over year versus last year. And actually, they're probably up about 10% versus what they were running right before the Lunar New Year celebration.
Well, that's interesting. So it goes against their downward trend following New Year. That's very interesting. I hadn't known that, and it's good to know.
In a big way. In a big way.
Oh yeah, 20% year over year and 10% sequentially over the weeks. That's not small. That's not small at all. So we've got a lot of impatience from the Westerners, whether they're Europeans or North Americans. It's funny, the Latinos here, they don't call us Americanos. No, that's because they're Americanos también also. They're Central Americans and they're South Americans. So they call us North Americans, and they don't distinguish between Canadians and U.S. natives. So we are more impatient than the Chinese. If you were to hear a Chinese guy say, an analyst say, or an expert or a market participant say, well, look for some changes very quickly after the Chinese New Year. Well, very quickly it might be a few months. Whereas an American would say, well, gee, nothing's happened in the last 4 or 5 days. They have a different perspective. They're planning. They've got a 5-year plan. When was the last time you heard Washington talk about an economic 5-year plan? No, they instead have a future economic propaganda package of BS that has no bearing in reality, whereas the Chinese actually do some planning. Unbelievable contrasts. And I'm looking forward to this year, although it's going to be, I think, tumultuous and disruptive. I'm looking forward to it, and I don't think we're going to see any acceleration of violence and propagation of war, conflagration of nukes. I don't think we're going to see any of that. And here's an indicator, guys. How quickly did Ebola exit the news? Very quickly. It was in it for a month, scared the heck out of a lot of people, and it's gone. The U.S. and the nasty cabal are losing their grip. And people can remain very frightened, or they can look at all the signals that point to how the cabal, that's what I call the banker syndicate, financial crime syndicate, which includes a lot more than just a financial group. It includes, say, the pharmaceutical companies. It includes the major press networks that are only owned by 5 companies. Right. So, and the food company, Monsanto. All right. So, anyway, wow, a lot's going on, and I'm optimistic. I really am. I think it's going to be a lot of pain, but I'm optimistic.
So what do you think some of the true reasons for the Ukraine war and the Russian confrontation? What do you think's going on with that? How does that tie into with everything that you were just saying?
Well, it ties into the West losing their grip. They noticed 2 years ago. Recall in 2012 is when QE started. QE is printing money, buying treasury bonds and mortgage bonds that nobody wants. Okay, so we printed money, did not drain the banking system of those funds, and injected it into the system. It's called unsterilized monetary inflation. It's bond monetization. It's debt monetization. It's what third world nations do, and Americans need to understand. We are acting like a third world nation on the financial sector. So 2 years later, the European nations, the Asian nations are working overtime to avoid the dollar. They set up the new development bank. The BRICS alliance is over 100 nations signing up. They're basically saying whatever you, Russia, China, and India want to do, and whatever Brazil and South Africa follow, in a consenting vote, whatever you do, we'll follow. Whatever you BRICS guys do, we'll follow. Whatever your BRICS organizations dictate, we'll follow. There are 100 nations now. All right, so the U.S. saw all this and noticed that Russia was courting Europe. So the United States interrupted it. The biggest visible factor for the Ukraine war motive was to interfere and to wreck the Russian connection with Europe. The establishment of the Eurasian trade zone, which I have made reference to for over 2 years in my analysis, the Eurasian trade zone, Europe and Asia, as George Orwell described. George Orwell was a very connected guy. He knew what was going on, and he talked about Oceania, namely Britain and the United States controlling the oceans, the maritime trade. Well, there's a land trade with Europe and Asia. They're not going to have maritime connections with Russia and Germany. No, they got pipelines, they got rail lines. You got several very large, heavy rail lines have been constructed just in the last 10 years between Russia and Germany. They're not going to follow through on these sanctions. I would like to point out, before I continue with the more visible motives for the war, like stealing gold and installing Monsanto seeds, I'd like to point out a very big motive that's come to my attention. It's not for the first time, but in detail, reinforced with a lot of the background painted for me. I believe the biggest motive for this Ukraine and war and the Russian confrontation is to conceal the theft, the stealing of Tsarist, that's CZAR, the Russian czars, Tsarist Russian gold from the 1910 decade. Now, I first came to learn about Russian gold, the Tsarist gold, being in the West, scattered around in central banks. I first heard about it about 6 or 8 years ago. I heard that, you've got some Russian markings on gold. That's rather common because there was a lot of Tsarist gold that was distributed in the West. Okay, well, that's a piece of evidence, a piece of information. Then I heard a year and a half ago, or whenever it was, Russia and their Mistral ship, a helicopter gunship vessel, the ship that had a contract with Russia. And I got some details. I wondered, well, what's that all about? And I heard, well, it's kind of a sweetener to encourage France to return the Tsarist gold. And now I'm coming to learn it's much, much bigger than that. I believe it was several thousand tons of gold that Tsar Nicholas II distributed to the United States and London in order to create and set up the League of Nations, which later became the United Nations, And what did the British and the Americans do in response? This was around the time of World War I, and League of Nations was a big topic back then. A lot of controversy over it. Will it ever work? Could it be practical? Should we do it? I mean, is it worth the time? How can we fund it? All right, so what did the British and the Americans do after Tsar Nicholas lent or gave? It's not clear. All this gold, I think thousands of tons of gold to New York and London. The Rothschilds financed the Bolshevik Revolution and installed communism and created the Soviet Union and had the Romanovs murdered. So was the Bolshevik Revolution cover up for a gold heist? Kind of like 9/11. Okay, so I heard a strange story, very hard to prove these things, that Andrei Kosygin, who was a Communist Party leader in, I think, the 1970s, he was a son of the Romanovs. They hid him away, and he was not murdered, along with all the other ones, by those that the Rothschilds hired. So this war in Ukraine and confrontation with Russia, that's including, from what I'm hearing, some failed first strike nuclear attempts. I don't want to get into that any more than what I just said. It could be to obstruct the current ongoing claims by the Kremlin to retrieve their gold from London, New York, and Paris. So the Western Central Bank franchise system might be predominantly Russian Tsarist gold that we don't want to give back, or that we cannot give back because we've spent it financing or supplying the gold market in London, the LBMA, and the COMEX in New York and Chicago. So instead of returning the gold to Russia, we declare war. This is how the West is acting dishonorably. Now I'd like to cover just some of the visible motives for this Ukraine-Russian war. Well, it wasn't 3 weeks after the Kiev regime fell that the U.S. and their masked men stole 33 tons of Kiev's central bank gold in the middle of the night and threatened the tower at the airport to get out of the way, shut up, this is over your heads. They're all masked men. It was 2 or 3 trucks. That's a lot of tons. 33 tons is 70,000 pounds of gold. It doesn't get put into the truck in 10 minutes. It gets put in the truck in a matter of a few hours. It's not 1 truck, it's 2, maybe 3 trucks. And the U.S. cover story was, it's going to New York for safekeeping at the New York Fed. Good luck in ever seeing that again, Kiev and Ukraine. That was stolen. That supplied the COMEX market for, let's just say a month or 2. It interrupted the war, interrupted the gas flow from Russian Gazprom to Europe. The United States does not want Europe to be dependent on Russian energy. They want Europe to sign the TTIP trade pact, and the lunatics in Washington actually believe that they can make up for the lost Russian gas with all the U.S.-based fracking. So I ask you, is Russia behind the lower oil price, or is the United States? Because the U.S. and North American fracking industry is utterly destroyed. If the United States was going to use fracking to supply Europe, then why did the United States destroy the fracking industry with a lower oil price? They did not. The Saudis and the Chinese worked with the Russians to lower the oil price, to destroy the petrodollar standard, de facto standard, and to wreck the fracking, which is something like 80% of all new oil output out of North America since 2007. I believe the U.S. is engaged in ridiculously stupid propaganda that they're trying to wound the Russian bear and lower their energy income, oil income, when the Rockefellers just got wrecked. In fact, I heard that this is not coming from a slouch source, that the Rockefellers have disposed of 80% of their oil-based assets. Okay, now move on. Ukraine has always been known as the breadbasket in Eastern Europe to supply European food. Okay, it's where their wheat fields are, it's where their corn fields are. Ukraine is like Iowa, Indiana, Illinois, beautiful farmland. Now it's overrun by Monsanto. So expect a lot of food supply going to Europe and the tables for dinner, for restaurants, to be GMO-infected food. You've got energy firm contracts to do fracked gas all over Western Ukraine and all over Romania, Bulgaria, Poland, all those Eastern European countries that have a hard time resisting the U.S. corporations and the U.S., say, Secretary of State and Vice President and all the Hillary and Biden companies with hidden executors. I'd like to point out that something that I heard recently, and very hard to confirm again, that there's a rare metal in eastern Ukraine, some mines that the Western banker cabal want their hands on. And I don't know what it is. It could be rhodium. It could be rare earths. I don't know. I'm trying to find out. So there's another motive. This kind of basic criminality, but for those who really followed the IMF relief money that came last summer to Ukraine and the Kiev regime, I got news. Over 90% of it was stolen. So when the IMF grants aid to Kiev and the regime, where's it going? It's going to the banker cabal. So they're basically tapping the IMF with central bank infusions of money and various governments pitching in to the IMF, and the banker cabal stealing it. This is just unbelievable. I'd like to also point out that Ukraine has always been a center of white women trafficking, but it's also had an increase in the last couple of years in human organ black market trafficking. And there was a story last September, October of 3,000 cadavers dumped in a forest outside Kiev, and they're all missing major organs. We've had silly propaganda estimates of like 3,000 or 4,000 deaths, dead bodies, victims, casualties, not wounds, dead, not wounded, but dead soldiers in Ukraine in the war. It's more like 10,000 or 12,000, maybe 15,000. And I heard some very clever statistically derived estimates of the dead count based on, for instance, wrecked armored vehicles and wrecked tanks. So you count the tanks, you count the armored vehicles, and then you use a multiplier from past wars. That's a very clever regression technique. I just had to nod my head and say, very clever, nice. Not complicated either. So I believe that the cabal wanted to ramp up the victims so they could, look, you know, you can get $20,000 for a human liver, $20,000 for a human kidney, and you get two of them. Whee! I know a little bit about organ transplants because I come from Pittsburgh, Carnegie Mellon. I'm not sure. I think third biggest medical complex in the United States behind Los Angeles and New York, and number one in kidney and liver transplants. And if you live in Pittsburgh or neighboring suburb, you are very familiar with the 2 and 3 per hour helicopter transport of these organs, mostly livers and kidneys, into the Pittsburgh Medical Community Complex, a string of hospitals. I've done some work with them. I have a professor friend who I'm still in contact with who has a lucrative contract with the medical community there doing brain research. doing brain modeling. Very interesting stuff. So the U.S., London, and a little ally on the southeast corner of the Mediterranean, which is, by the way, the center of human organ black marketing, they kind of like seeing a lot of victims out of Ukraine because it's already a good organ trafficking center. So they just ramped it up. And I think lastly, on a political basis, they wanted to, and this is a stupid concept because it's so impractical. They wanted to set up a fascist stronghold and model. They wanted a showcase. They wanted a showcase of a successful fascist regime. I'm sorry, but it had been a bigger failure for fascism as a demo. It's a demo of criminality, failure, civilian murders, and more, including demos of micronuclear events like 9/11. Oh boy. So I think I covered a lot, both the visible things like gold and Monsanto gas flow and the Eurasian trade zone, but we must start paying attention to it's hard to call it stolen. How about reneged? I love that word, reneged. If we borrowed the Tsarist Russian gold, then we reneged on it, and I don't see a great deal of difference between a renege on several thousand tons of gold and its theft, especially if you see the war and various other measures to prevent any legitimate return. This looks and smells like a theft and looks and smells like 2 generations of central banks in the West were funded by Russian gold, and they want it back, so we paint them as villains. Wow. This is 1 step or 2 steps higher than painting Iran as a rogue nation developing nuclear weapons to destroy our friends in the Middle East. This is 2 levels more ugly.
It's all ugly.
It's indescribably ugly. And the outcome is going to be death of the dollar. The outcome is going to be reinstallation globally of the gold standard. This is the backfire, the backlash. Blowback is a CIA term. This is the blowback. The death of the dollar. And I think the petrodollar as a de facto standard died a year ago. And that's why you're seeing the dollar rise on the DX index. The various Forex derivatives are crashing, being dissolved, liquidating, and settling in dollars, which demand that which force the banks to demand dollars and settle them. It's like, you've got this contract and you go to the bank and say, I want to settle this. And they say, okay, well, we're going to have to get the dollars to do that. And this is done on a grand scale. That's why the dollar is going up. It's not rising in value. It's just going up as it dies. The dollar is going to go up, 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 suffocate the entire world, and then die and be replaced. And I'm beginning to think it's not just Greece and Ukraine to cause problems for the bankers. It's going to be the emerging market debt that's denominated in dollars. Remember, QE offered free money. So the bankers, since 2011, well, the 0% started in 2009. 2 years later, 2011, we had QE. I think I said 2012 before, 2011. So with the 0%, the West has been funding emerging market debt at very cheap levels. But more importantly, more important than the interest rate is the dollar denomination. So if you see a 20% decline in I'll just throw out a country, Bangladesh. In their Bangladesh currency, 20% decline. Well, it's like the interest rate went up 20% every year. Okay, so interest rate is not important. Currency denomination of the emerging market debt is important. So we're going to see Greece, Ukraine, and emerging markets kill the dollar, along with the Saudis, because they're aligning now with China and not talking about it, but we've got these monthly meetings between China and Saudis, and I think the Chinese are going to do something very interesting and constructive. I think they're going to tell the Saudis and the other Emirate nations, make peace with Iran. Get done with this. Get mature. Quit swallowing the U.S. and British plan of constant conflict. Start working toward constant cooperation. That's the Chinese way. The U.S. method is, create disruption and constant chaos. Pepe Escobar has a great name for it. He called it the Empire of Chaos. Well, it's coming to an end. The King Dollar has 4 legs, and I don't think any of the legs are still operating. So those are my thoughts regarding Ukraine and Russia, and a little bit more extending to the petrodollar. Exciting times.
Very exciting times.
If we can just get through and avoid a global war, and I don't think we're going to have a global war. I know a lot of people do. So, okay.
Dave?
It seems like the U.S. is certainly trying to escalate it in that direction. But I've sort of argued, a lot of people are kind of, in our camp, are kind of impatient. Why doesn't Russia and China lash out in a more aggressive fashion to sort of stop the U.S. from making all these advances? And my view is that both China and Russia are showing remarkable tolerance in enduring the BS that the U.S. is throwing out there, because they know if they flex too hard, the U.S. is likely to unleash some nukes. I mean, it's the foundation of the U.S. military policy now that the U.S. can win a first strike nuclear war.
Yeah, well, I think in similar lines, I believe in parallel, I believe that Russia and China are showing tolerance for 2 reasons. Let the U.S. be exposed for what they're doing and their propaganda and their motives and their actions. And secondly, let Germany and Europe depart from the U.S. camp. So rather than respond with force, what they're doing, in particular the Kremlin and Putin, what they're doing is allowing the European Union to split from the United States. And that's pretty powerful. That's not just a political split, it's economic split. I think sometime this year we're going to see Europe say we don't want to have anything more to do with the Russian sanctions. The big question for me is, will this come before China starts purchasing Southern European agricultural businesses? Because the Russian ban has crippled the big farm businesses in Italy, Spain, Portugal, and France. So is China going to buy them up, or is Europe going to get its act together and move away from the U.S. camp and force this EU split against the United States? That's what the Kremlin's doing. They're putting a crowbar in there, and they're continuing. I got some very unusual information. Exxon increased by 350% its investments in Russia last year. Well, I thought they had some Russian sanctions. So they halted in a very visible Arctic exploration project, but they expanded a whole lot others, like in Siberia and the Pacific coast of Russia. So I think the Russian strategy of showing tolerance and letting the U.S. support wither away, I think that's succeeding. And, I'm very patriotic. I don't like what I'm seeing. I don't like to see a takeover of my country's government and finances and foreign policy. I don't like to see it. I want to see the Constitution restored, and I find it just incredibly paradoxical that people who want the Constitution restored are called anti-patriotic.
What is up is down, and what is left is right.
Yeah. I don't buy into it.
Well, that's the new norm.
Our government's definitely been co-opted by the neocons. No question about that.
For a long time, and what I find remarkable is that people still think in terms of the Republican and Democrat Party. And if you look at the Secretary of State, you see no change in the neocons in control. And if you look at the Department of Treasury, you see no change in Wall Street banks in control. So there's no difference. All the political campaigning and the voting, it's all distraction. I look to see who's in charge of Treasury and State. The rest is almost irrelevant.
Yep. I completely agree with that, and I've been telling people that for a long time. It's not Democrats versus Republicans. It's basically us versus them, and them being the people who control the government.
Right. It's the banker cabal that has many extensions beyond finance, because they must control the networks, press networks, in order to make sure the propaganda. I mean, my brother is a smart guy. He's got a Phi Beta Kappa degree in economics and political science, double major, yet he still makes these snide comments about Russia throwing their weight around, being aggressive, taking over Crimea, and now Putin being a prick. So I come back with force. I say, I don't think you know an effing thing about Russia, the Kremlin, their central bank, Putin, or anything Russian. Anything Russian. Don't think you know anything about their gold. Don't think you know about their foreign policy. Don't think you know anything about their alliances. Don't think you know anything about their weapons allies or military allies. I don't think you know an effing thing about anything to do with Russia in 5 categories, period. Furthermore, I don't think you know anything about money. So that's my response to my older brother.
Well, and that's really the way it is for 90% of this country. I mean, they get their news from the mainstream media. You don't hear anything in the mainstream media about how Russia's been dumping treasuries and accumulating the crap out of gold.
Right. What you hear is the opposite, that they're spending their gold to fortify their ruble.
Right.
And they're not doing that at all. They're spending their dollars received from the energy, mostly oil, and they're converting it to gold. And now they've recently set up some very strong lines. I call them belt lines. The Russian ruble and the Chinese yuan now have ample trade and connections between the two. So we haven't isolated Russia. What we're doing is we're splitting Europe away from the United States, and we're isolating ourselves in the United States. This blowback is going to make history. U.S. isolation is going to make history. And before long, I don't know how long. Could be a year, could be 6 months, could be 4, could be a year and a half. I don't know. We're going to have to replace the dollar, because the Treasury bond, the Treasury bill, more short-term too, they're not going to be accepted. So how are we going as a nation and economy in the United States to assure import supply from foreign nations if they don't take our money? Americans don't think this way. They don't think in these terms. They don't think about, oh gosh, the dollar's great, it's going up. Foreigners love it even more. No, they're not. The dollar's going up because it's dying. And foreigners are rejecting the dollar. They're accepting the Chinese RMB. They're doing trade in RMB. They're setting up RMB trading hubs in London and Frankfurt and Hong Kong. They're setting up yuan swap facilities in 30 countries. They don't want the dollar. So how's the U.S. going to supply its import supply chains, the channels? How are they going to supply it if foreigners don't want the treasury bill. They're going to say, we don't want that. We want RMB. We want gold. The gold trade note's going to be a big splash. I think it's going to come in several months. The gold trade note is going to be essentially a letter of credit backed by gold. And that's going to be the trade. That's going to be the big splash on the trade front that affects the financial side in the West. All right, United States, you want some import supply from India and from South Korea? Where are your gold trade notes? Cash in your treasury bills for the gold trade notes and then watch the dollar decline like a stone. That's when they need to come in with the new dollar.
You think something like that could happen this year?
Yes, I do.
Because
look at the progress. Look at all the progress that you've seen with the platforms. These platforms are the New Development Bank, Crisis Reserve Account, Asian Infrastructure, Shanghai Gold Exchange, debt rating agencies, credit cards, SWIFT alternatives. It's not for sport. It's to replace the dollar. First in trade, second in banking. With all this accelerated progress, I think we're going to see the U.S. Department of Treasury announce some tentative plans. And they've already done so to a minor extent for a replacement of the dollar. It's not going to be the Amero. That's just real stupid talk. Mexico and Canada are not going to unite with us. And for reasons you may not expect, it's more like Canada knows they can replenish their gold quickly. Look, they've got the Rocky Mountain Range up in Canada just like we do in the United States. And with Mexico, it's the other way around. They know they can replace with precious metal, namely silver, for their reserves to back a currency. And the United States is going to insist that they've got this deep storage gold. It's going to be a huge lie, and it's going to take a matter of weeks or months to unmask the U.S. lie. They're going to come out and say, we've got an asset-backed new dollar, backed by gold, backed by oil reserves. It's going to be a lie. I think to some extent we might back a new dollar with Alaskan oil. Let me ask you folks a question. Why do you think they turned off the Gulf of Mexico for oil supply with 2,500 rigs in the Gulf of Mexico? I know it was because of the British Petroleum Deepwater Horizon oil rig that exploded. Thank you, Halliburton. Job well done. So we know how they got shut down, but we don't know why the 2,500 Gulf of Mexico rigs were shut down. Was it to make sure the United States in its continental waters has sufficient oil to back a new dollar? This is how I think, suspiciously.
That's interesting. Although, if the global standard is a gold-backed trading note, what good is an oil-backed dollar going to do?
It means it'll be accepted. It means it won't be trashed.
Yeah,
but I don't think it'll be in sufficient volume. You really are going to need monetary metal behind a new currency. We've had a 40-year experience of essentially black gold backing the dollar, providing its foundation. We've been on a petrodollar de facto standard ever since 73. And notice that it didn't take us long. In 1971, we broke the gold standard. Bretton Woods was broken by Nixon. And 2 years later, Kissinger, as an agent for the Rockefellers, didn't negotiate with the Arabs. He suggested that they quadruple the oil price. And he told them, look, you'll be swimming in riches and you'll be able to buy U.S. weapons. We both win. and the economies will adapt. We'll just monetize it. We'll just inflate everything. And remember the price inflation in the early 70s, 10, 12, 14% a year. That was our reaction. So the Rockefellers brought about a higher oil price, instituted the black gold standard behind the dollar, and allowed the U.S. economy and the global economy, especially Western economies, to suffer price inflation and recession for 3 or 4 years to recover so that they could have a quantum lift in their wealth. That 71-73 sequence of Bretton Woods followed by the Arab oil embargo is very important in financial history and not well understood and not suggested by the Arabs. Remember, we control the press. So we said to the world that the Arabs were angry at U.S.-Israel support. Arabs didn't say that. We did. We put those words and motives in the Arabs' mouths. And I don't think the Saudis really mind it because they don't think they have any love lost for the Israelis. I don't know. I don't care. The important thing is that we control the situation. So you're not going to be able to put oil as a constant solid backing for a new dollar. And besides, the Saudis, the Russians, and the Chinese might have brought down the oil price to the point where the United States cannot use oil as a backing for the new dollar and must use gold and silver. So I really believe that Russia and China are behind the lower oil price. Remember, we used this tool in '98 to wreck the Soviet Union's economy. And I think this is vengeance in return. They learned how to use it. They saw that 85% of all the new oil being produced since 2007 on a global scale was done from fracking at a higher cost. So they just brought down the oil price. And I'm really wondering what's in it for the Saudis. But here's just a theory of mine, that the Saudis didn't mind bringing down the oil price because they're going to wreck their OPEC competitors, have an explosion of income, even if it's at a lower, explosion of volume, say, even if it's at a lower price. And then they're going to get out of town because they're depleted. They don't mind a lower oil price if they can have a rally to steal the last remaining natural resources from Saudi Arabia and then get out of town. They own all kinds of Los Angeles and southern Spain property and Swiss property. So let's watch to see if the Saudi royals bug out. HSBC announced in the last couple of weeks that they're shutting down their 7 private gold vaults.
Yes.
And I think they're lying. I think they're closing down their GLD fund vaults as well. And they're trying to cover up a few years worth of gold thefts. I think there's been a vast pilferage of private account gold and GLD fund gold in order to feed the supply lines of London and the New York COMEX. This story has really moved to the back pages, which is interesting. But remember, the banker cabal owns the press networks. Here's a basic reason why they might have wanted to close their vaults: to avoid the costs, very high costs, of operating empty gold vaults. Mm-hmm. I mean, people don't think much unless you're in the business, but operating a gold vault is very costly, very expensive. You have security and you have insurance. You don't have to, maintain, air-conditioned control. No, we're talking about inert metal here. You need to prevent thefts. You need to prevent underground tunnels from coming out of nowhere. And you need to insure it for deliveries and just insure it in general, because people won't put their gold there. No one's going to put, $80 million in a vault without knowing that it's insured. Okay, so avoid costs. I think they wanted to destroy the data because lawsuits are coming, legal prosecutions coming. A lot of investors in the GLD have not read properly the prospectus, and they're going to maybe file some nuisance law claims. I don't know. But the people who had their private account gold in the bullion bank of HSBC are going to have legal claims that are very legitimate to use the courts and go after HSBC. So I wouldn't be at all surprised in a few years if HSBC is gone. All right. They want to remove evidence of GLD gold fund raids. Now, there's a lot of illegal activity regarding GLD. And it's not just that the big Wall Street and London banks put together a bunch of shares, they short them, put together a bunch of equity asset collateral and short the GLD shares and go in and help themselves to the gold. Well, there's been a practice in the last 2 or so years. I know it's at least a year and a half. If you're an investor and you've got your minimum number of shares for a GLD withdrawal, they're refusing your request for the gold medal, even though you have legally, according to their own prospectus and operating rules, you legally have what they require to do a withdrawal. So they're only doing it for the club members of the big banks. All right, so there's a lot of evidence in there, and I think they want to get rid of it. They want to get rid of it because they've been supplying the COMEX and the LBMA, which are really attached at the hip.
Do you see a fire in their future?
Well, I don't know. It could be. JP Morgan has had about 3 fires in their past. Okay, there's also another angle that doesn't seem to be a natural thing to think of in terms of, Western thinking. But it could be that Shanghai and the Chinese, who took control of the gold fix, and HSBC was a member of the gold fix along with Barclays and Deutsche Bank, the London gold fix. The Chinese might have told HSBC, shut down. That's it, you're done, shut down. We're taking control of the gold fix, and this is our condition. So the Chinese are giving marching orders to London that effectively have, for the last 2 years or more, starved London of their gold. And in the hat trick letter, I talk about a number of different things. Here's a very interesting, clever concept that I give credit to Euroraj. He's on my team of colleagues. We have about 10 of us, and 3 or 4 come up with these amazing analytic points that are often borne out with evidence and support in the following months. Euroraj argued to me a year ago, he said, I've got a theory that the GLD fund is a manner of collateralizing and monetizing, securitizing rather. Let me back up. The GLD fund is a device to securitize, make a sellable, tradable share for markets, financial markets, of gold in motion. And I've mentioned this concept in many past radio shows, but here's how it works. You've got a big gold mine in North America or South Africa or wherever, Australia. Those are 3 big centers. Mexico. You've got output coming from their mills. The mills are located nearby their mines. So there is time between movement of the gold from the mills to the refiners and to the market. They're like 90% pure out of the mill, and they're like 99% something pure out of the refineries. But between the time it passes by truck, between the mill and delivery at the market in the vaults, like HSBC or whatever, JP Morgan's vaults, Scotia Makota's vaults in Canada, between the time of the mill traffic to the ramp of the market, that gold is just moving around. So Wall Street and London decided, this is the theory Euroraj came up with, and I think it's very valid, especially with recent evidence that I'll conclude with, that they securitized in GLD gold in motion. So the effective zero inventory of the HSBC run GLD fund, officially called the SPDR Gold Trust, the effective zero inventory is something like 650 to 750 tons. And that's exactly now, I think it's 740, 730 metric tons in the GLD listings. And if you want some confusion to demonstrate that they're playing games with their bar list, take a look at the past and you see multiple evidence of individual serial numbers, which I think covers up their gold in motion, which doesn't yet have a serial number. So they've got to make phony the 600 to 700 million, I'm sorry, 1,000 tons. No, I'm sorry, not that. What am I saying? The 600 or 700 tons that are in movement from mining projects. They don't have serial numbers, so they falsify the bar list. There's lots of evidence. GATA has been, Gold Antitrust Action Organization has been all over the falsified HSBC bar lists, all over it. So I reason that another motive to bring about the shutdown, not a motive, more evidence that HSBC is empty, is that they're down to their effective zero, which is the estimate that I had for a year, 650 to 750 tons for gold in motion. There's another, just a possible, I just want to throw this out there. It's just, I don't know for sure, but I have a feeling HSBC lost a lot of money with the Swiss D-peg, where they dropped their 120 euro peg, the Swiss franc euro peg. I think they lost a lot of money in the Forex, and it just put a lot of strain on their entire set of businesses. It's hard it's hard to prove that. It's hard to prove anything nowadays. Most of the evidence and data is being manipulated and changed and thrown away and ends up gone. And oh, by the way, there was a fire. You mentioned fire as motive to get rid of data. There was a fire in Brooklyn, which pretty much destroyed evidence that the president of President Poroshenko of Ukraine was given U.S. citizenship years ago. This guy is like a U.S. puppet in the real sense, having lived in New York. U.S. citizenship granted to him, and probably promised him a president post once we toppled the regime there. Oh boy. Yeah. There's some other fires. I'm hearing, I'd like to get some more details, that there was a very valuable historical library in Russia. I don't know if it was in the Kremlin. I know there was a recent Kremlin Tower fire, but I don't know if it's related to this. But there was a very valuable historical library that had a fire in Moscow. And it was believed that it saw the destruction through fire of some of the evidence of the Tsarist gold being lent to the U.S. and London. So fire is a very common tool. J.P. Morgan had a fire in Houston to cover up some of their mortgage bond fraud. Fire is very common. And you can always blame it on some of the silliest things. I don't care about stated motive. I care about where's the billion-dollar advantage, multi-billion-dollar advantage. Yeah. The stories are really kind of sideshow and graffiti on the wall. Who cares? I'm looking at the billion-dollar motive to do that. And usually there is one, because a wise man once told me a few years ago, there are no billion-dollar coincidences.
No.
So, for instance, it wasn't a fire at the Murrah building in Oklahoma City, but, that's kind of a fire. It satisfied some of the Satanist April and May celebration of fire requirements. but the Murrah building in Oklahoma City housed a lot of data regarding Clinton and Papa Bush stealing $1.6 trillion worth of Fannie Mae money. So fire is a common mechanism for covering up big multi-billion-dollar crimes. So interesting times, and wow, we covered some good ground here.
I would say.
And
thank you.
I would encourage people to go to www.goldenjackass.com, and there's a lot of free information in there, public articles, other radio interviews. And there are a lot more radio interviews than there are public articles anymore the last 2 years. Something really changed in 2012 or so. I started getting invited a lot more for radio shows like this. And it was because of correct forecasts. My team is brilliant, and especially the voice. He likes to keep a lower profile. But they supply me with a lot of good information, and we chew over things and come up with some good theories. Pardon me. Euroraj had another interesting theory. I like giving credit to my team when it's due. Euroraj had a theory a year ago that the big Belgian bulge of $400 billion in treasury bonds, which is equal, by the way, to the entire Belgian GDP, that might have been BRICS nations putting up their treasury bonds from reserves in order to have them converted to gold. So the Belgian bulge could be gold in movement toward the sourcing of the BRICS central bank for gold. That's Euroraj. And London Paul confirmed some news last June and July and August. The Voice told me Germany has already made a decision to leave the euro common currency and to leave the European Union and to submit, Germany to submit their representation, their hoard of gold toward the Nordic euro, gold-backed Nordic euro. The Voice is a very funny man sometimes. He said, Jim, you had a bunch of correct forecasts, and now you're admitting that you had, this was back in 2013 or so. He said, you're admitting that you have 2 errors and 19 correct forecasts, and I need to slow you down. One of your wrong forecasts, as you state, is that Germany will put forward a Nordic euro that's gold-backed. You're not wrong. You're just late. It hasn't happened yet. It's going to happen. And now I'm hearing it's going to be wrapped into the BRICS gold currency, gold and silver backed currency. So my point is that London Paul confirmed from his independent Russian sources and Chinese source, I think mostly Russian sources, he's got a couple of them, that the Voice is correct, that Germany has already flipped. That they're already they already decided they're going to join what I call the Eurasian Trade Zone and what Putin is now calling the Eurasian Economic Union, the EEU. So my team confirms the various scoops and sources. It's a very valuable team, and I give them a lot of credit, and we stay very collegial and friendly, and we talk occasionally, and I don't meet them much, so I've had a few conversations with everybody on my team. Well, except one. So anyway, go to the www.goldenjackass.com website. Check out the free material. Sign up for the hat trick letter, and this is a common response that I get from people. They say, "I've been reading your material for free." Public articles and listening to your interviews for free. Been doing that for a year or more. But I decided to sign up for your newsletter, and I was really surprised at how you add so much more in the newsletter. I didn't know it was possible, but you tie things together. You provide a lot more background stories that reinforce your points. On your radio shows, I thought you were maybe full of crap on a couple things, but when I read your report, I see all the reinforced arguments, and I see you tie things together very, very well in your report. So that's the paid Hat Trick Letter newsletter. So anyway, I thank you for having me on. It's the first time we've been on, and maybe we'll do this again sometime.
I hope so.
Yeah, we'd love to have you back, Jim.
Yeah, this has been great.
Well, it's been a pleasure. I'm running out of voice, which happens even though I douse it with a little bit of water. But it's good being on, and I hope this attracts a good audience of listeners. And people really need to wake up and stop absorbing and swallowing the major network news. What I'm noticing in the last few months is the major network news in the United States is getting more ludicrous, more absurd. And I'd like to mention one thing in closing. This is my last thing I'm going to say. Take a look at some of the film clips of the beheadings by ISIS. There's zero blood squirting from the neck. Now, I know many of us never witnessed a beheading, but we know in theory that there's blood pressure in the human body, and the human head contains 20 to 30 or more % of all the blood in the body. When you cut a head off, the blood squirts 3 to 5 feet in a very big volume. And for those who saw the TV show of the Miami-based serial killer Dexter, he was a blood spurt analyst. Every murder, when there's penetrating of the skin of the human body, has blood spurt. If you blow a hole with a bullet in the chest, you get a big blood spurt. If you cut off the neck, you get an enormous blood spurt. None of the ISIS films have any blood spurt. They're all fabricated.
That's all they've got is propaganda and lies.
Well, yeah, they've also got military.
Yeah, the war dollar.
The war dollar, and they've got viruses, and they got sanctions. They have a lot of different weapons, but now what we're seeing is the financial weapons are being used now in blowback to weaken, cripple, and then remove the dollar. And it's coming. They're making great progress. As a patriot, I want the dollar to be gold-backed, gold and silver-backed. It's in the Constitution. It's not an anti-patriotic comment. I want the dollar to be gold-backed, silver-backed. I want a restoring of the gold standard. This sequence of financial crises in the last 30 years is not normal. The wars are not normal. They're consequences of abrogating the gold standard, which have facilitated an unspeakable amount of theft, pilferage, just like in Ukraine. 33 tons. I'd like to have 33 tons moved from a truck. Heck, I'll make 600 trips in a little Toyota SUV. No problem. Let me know where to pick it up. No, we need to get back to the gold standard in order to put on the right footing the entire global economy, because everything is going to crap right now. And QE is not stimulus, it is capital destruction. We learned it in school. Hyperinflation kills capital. This is no different, even though Wall Street tells us otherwise, even though Janet Yellen and Bernanke told us otherwise, even though our clown Department of Treasury secretaries, Jacob Lew, Tim Geithner, these clowns telling us that QE is stimulus. No, it's not. It's their free lunch. It's killing the economy. Watch all the retail chain companies go bust this year, including Sears. Sears will make the splash. Okay, all right, guys, I could go on. I have a hard time shutting up, but
Hey, Jim, thanks a lot for your
Yes.
time. This has been great.
It's been really, really good. And thank you very much for all of your time.
Well,
and we've been
all right, it's a pleasure being on, and I'm exaggerating about my voice. My voice will be just fine in the next few minutes. And I can go yell at some. I can go yell at some Latino who tries to run me down when I'm walking across the street. I know how to yell, and I can yell in Spanish now. I'm getting better.
That's good.
Interesting. You brought up the fabricated beheading videos, because one buddy of mine who, I mean, he just sits on the internet and looks at everything all day. The first thing he said to me was, he goes, "You see that beheading video they're showing on the news?" He goes, that's not an ISIS produced beheading video, because if you've seen any of the other videos that are authentic, he said they're really gory and they're really crudely produced. He's like, that one's really highly, edited and engineered. And then another buddy of mine who we actually just had him on our podcast last week, John Titus. He's spent the better part of the last 2 years learning how to do video editing. And the first thing he said to me was, he goes, they're not even, if you have a trained eye for editing, you can see that they're just complete fabrication.
Green screen.
Yeah.
What you can also see is the numerous seams, SEAM, seams, where they splice pieces together.
Yeah, that's what he was saying.
And what I'm noticing is that we're seeing a lot more now forensic evidence of falsification for, say, the Boston Marathon event. Many of these are fabricated. The Aurora, Colorado incident, the theater, that was fabricated.
Yeah.
And what I've noticed is the woman who was the attorney for the guy charged in Aurora, Colorado, or one of the other Colorado incidents at the movie theater. I'm not saying that they weren't dead people, but there's some fabricated elements to it. The woman who was the attorney for the fellow in court with the flaming red hair is the same woman who was a grieving parent at Sandy Hook, who is the same woman photographed in what they call the Crisis Actors Guild in South Florida. It's the same woman. Gosh, she gets around a lot. I'm surprised. I'm surprised she didn't have her leg supposedly blown off at the Boston Marathon.
No, they already had somebody for that position.
Yeah, they have that, and what unfortunately they have their patsies for prosecution and putting them in prison. Oh, job well done, justice served. Okay, I got nothing more to say.
Well, Jim, we certainly appreciate
we really
it.
appreciate it.
Okay, well, it's a pleasure being on, and good luck to you guys, and I hope to be in touch with you sometime in the future.
Yep, we'll have you back on soon.
Okay,
All
very
right.
good.
All right,
All
thank
right.
you so much. Bye-bye.